celebrating a second term.
Vive la République! Et vive la France!
The French president defeats his far-right rival and vows to unite the country. But can he really bring change to France? And is this the end of Marine Le Pen? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is Emmanuel Macron. On Monday morning, France woke up to 5 more years of Emmanuel Macron. The centrist leader is the first French president to secure re-election since Jacques Chirac in 2002. But while he won in a landslide in 2017, this year's result was much closer. Macron may have picked up about 58% of the vote, but Marine Le Pen, the face of the far right in France, had her best showing ever, and she's vowed to keep fighting.
Un grand vent de liberté aurait pu se lever sur le pays.
A great breeze of liberty could have arisen in the country. I respect the result of the vote, although I wanted otherwise. Despite 2 weeks of disloyal, brutal, and violent methods, similar to what the French are suffering every day, the ideas that we represent are reaching their peak on the night of the second round of the presidential election. With more than 43% of votes, tonight's results represent in itself a shining victory.
So Emmanuel Macron may have secured another term, but how much support does he really have? Well, for many in France, a vote for the incumbent was more about keeping Le Pen out rather than keeping Macron in. Prior to the runoff, one university graduate said it was like choosing between the plague and cholera. Some couldn't even bring themselves to vote. Turnout was just under 72%, the lowest since 1969, and 3 million people either spoiled their ballot or left it blank. But Macron understands just how polarized France has become, and he's promised to unite the country.
I know that for many of our compatriots who chose the extreme right today, their anger and disagreements which led them to vote for this project must also find a response, and that will be my responsibility and that of those around me.
But while Macron may be celebrating today, his rivals have already turned their attention to June's legislative elections. Le Pen may not have won the presidency, but she has made major gains, and that can only be good for her far-right National Rally Party. In 2017, they won only 8 seats, and this time she is desperate to do better.
La partie n'est pas tout à fait jouée.
The match is not completely over, since in a few weeks, the legislative elections will take place. With the legislative vote that will dominate over political trends that are false, as we know, the parliamentary representation risks of seeing Emmanuel Macron mechanically hold on to all powers, executive and legislative, are high. This is a perspective that no patriot, no Democrat can accept, as long as Emmanuel Macron's program is king-like, in which the social aspect remains divisive and destructive for France.
Et pour la France.
So Emmanuel Macron has a difficult task ahead of him. He no longer enjoys the popular support he once had, and many inside France feel his first term was a disaster. The French president does, however, have another 5 years, and he's promising a renewed approach.
This era will not be the same as the 5 years before, but the collective invention of a revised method for 5 better years at the service of our country, of our youth.
So after a night of celebration for Macron's supporters, is there a sense of change in the air? Let's find out what's happening now on the ground in France, and our Francis Collings joins us from Paris. Hi, Francis. Okay, we know the French public voted for him, but they don't necessarily support him per se. So is there any sense of enthusiasm now about what's to come and what might actually change?
You know, it's hard to tell. We all work within our bubbles, of course, but no, there was a palpable sense of relief I noticed last night at the park, the Champ de Mars, below the Eiffel Tower at these celebrations. Before that, people sort of saying, you know, we don't know which way this is going to go, which is quite an unusual feeling I've noticed from this election compared to others that I've watched and covered here. So enthusiasm, no. I think it really is a case of better the person you know, but he's fully aware, is Macron, and he showed that in his speech afterwards, that there are divisions, there are people who didn't vote for him, and he made note of the fact that a lot of people voted for him just to keep out the far right. So it's not the most comfortable feeling for him, and I wouldn't say there was a lot of enthusiasm, and I feel there's going to be a lot more of a challenge ahead for him in his second term, perhaps compared to his first term, which of course was characterized in the early years by the gilets jaunes, the yellow jacket protests. We expect those to come back. There are still similar issues that people are grieved about, not grieved enough to go to the far right and elect Marine Le Pen.
Right. You know, so I guess it's just a sense more of relief than excitement. But, you know, Francis, on paper, his record could be well interpreted. You know, by some measures, they say he created well over 1 million jobs. Purchasing power has actually increased for a lot of French people, but still he remains popular. So did he do a bad job, or do people just not like him because many actually just see him as this elitist?
Yeah, I think it's a mixture of a number of things. He is seen as elitist. He can't really help his rather haughty manner. There was an awful lot of discussion and a lot of mirth when the pictures even came out of him with a hairy chest. People wondering what exactly he was aiming at. Was that his way of connecting with people? He certainly got out onto the stump to lots of different places, trying to talk directly, dealing with hecklers. But yes, when it comes to the economy, things are not going as badly as it is portrayed. The economy has bounced back from the pandemic. It's bounced back very well. Unemployment is at a 10-year low. He's loosening up business laws that he says are very restrictive. And also as a result of COVID-19, he's very interested in the re-industrialization of this country, of bringing back the creation of jobs, of marketing within France, as opposed to being a nation that has been importing like a lot of Western nations. But bear in mind as well, he is something of a fortuitous politician, because there has been the demise of the parties that have dominated French politics for the last 60 years. And also everything he's been talking about not wanting to be reliant on things like imports and Russian oil, needing green energy. That has been helped enormously by what is going on in Ukraine. There are problems financially because of Ukraine, but his vision for the future for this country, relying more on green technology, green energy, and less reliance on someone like Vladimir Putin, well, that is coming to pass.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the stable economy, given the global context right now, actually does say a lot. But let's move on to Marine Le Pen while I have you. You know, both she and her father were never known for giving up, and she now has her eye on the next prize, being the legislative elections. Where do you see that going, and how much could it change, A, what Macron will have to go up against, and B, the political dynamics and the social dynamics in France?
Well, the way it does seem to play out is with the demise of the traditional parties, of the Conservatives, of the Socialists, who were only in power in 2017. Don't forget, under Francois Hollande, the centre ground is taken by Macron, who dips from centre left to centre right. So it seems the only space is on the extreme fringes, be it the right wing, be it the left. Bearing in mind that Jean-Luc Mélenchon of the far left got 22% in the first round, 7 million votes. He's saying, elect me for the National Assembly and my party, and make me Prime Minister, and I will have the power because I will make it awkward for Macron with the things that I disagree with. Marine Le Pen, it was pointed out by Eric Zemmour, also of the far right, who also stood in the first round, that if you are a Le Pen, you tend to lose an election. Rather caustic, but it's honest. She's had 3 goes at this, and 3 times she's come up short. She will say, and her supporters say, that they're being closer to power on this occasion than at any time since World War II.
Okay.
And the vote for the far right has been increasing over the last 20 years. It's something that Macron has said he's unhappy with.
Francis Collings, for us there in Paris, thank you so much for being with us. We greatly appreciate it. So let's broaden out the discussion now and welcome 3 new guests from New York. We have Denis Franceskin, a member of Marine Le Pen's national rally and also the party's representative abroad. Franco-Algerian journalist Nabila Ramdani joins us from London. And from Saint-Malo, we have Jacques Reland, a senior research fellow at the Global Policy Institute. Thanks all so much for being with us. Nabila, let's first talk about this result. Yes, it was a solid margin for Macron, but 42% of the French electorate voted for the far right, and that is up from 33% in 2017. And back in 2002, I mean, her father, Jean-Marie Le Pen, only took 18% against Jacques Chirac at the time. So taken over time, I mean, that is a pretty phenomenal rise in popularity for a party that used to be very much on the margins. What does it say to you about where France is today and how it's changed?
Well, I still think it was a very predictable victory for Emmanuel Macron. In terms of a simple election result, it's déjà vu all over again. 5 years ago, Emmanuel Macron predictably defeated Marine Le Pen to become president of France. And yesterday, we had the exact same outcome. And opinion polls suggested Macron would win from very early on, just as he did 5 years ago. And despite all the overblown noise, there was not a single credible poll that ever suggested that Marine Le Pen could win. So it was a very convincing victory for Emmanuel Macron. Effectively, not the landslide of 66% of the vote from 5 years ago, but more than enough to win elections. That's how democracy works. And dare I say, I think
Still, but Nabila, I mean, over the trajectory of the last few decades in France, we've seen the popularity of that far-right party go from 18% to 42% in a presidential election. Does that concern you?
It has to be put in the context of what the National Front and indeed the National Rally stands for. Let's not get carried away. Marine Le Pen has a very poor track record as a politician. She's effectively a serial loser, to put it bluntly. It took her 4 attempts to become an MP in 2017 after being rejected a number of times for years by her constituency in northern France. Currently, she only has 6 members of parliament out of 577 MPs. So it's not exactly that electoral powerhouse that we're talking about. She struggles as a would-be politician, and indeed it is her 3rd attempt to become president of France.
Okay, let me ask Jacques. I mean, should we not overestimate the rise of this far-right party over the past few decades? Do you think she'll remain, Marine Le Pen will remain a serial loser, as Nabila puts it?
If she stays in the race, yes, she will remain a serious loser. Yes, I will not overinterpret this figure saying that 42% of people voted for the far right. First, let's look at the European context. Far-right vote has increased everywhere in Europe as a result of concerns about immigration, security, Islamism, etc. But if Marine Le Pen increased the vote this time, it's also because she appealed to the working classes. And that is the main element. And not all of them are hard right-wingers. Many of people are more concerned about how to make their ends meet. And we can see that in the results, that she's neck and neck with Macron in the age group 25 to 50, people who are worried, who find it hard, think that the work doesn't pay enough, and so on. This time, her campaign this time was not based on immigration, because Zemmour had taken the mantle of immigration and insecurity, the 4 I's, as we say, Islam, immigration, insecurity, identity. Instead, she focused rightly, and that was a very wise decision, on the impact of the Ukraine war and of the COVID crisis on the cost of living. And that's where she scored first. But then, unfortunately for her, it's not a very firm ground for her. And during the debate, Macron was able to demonstrate that economic policies were incoherent, and instead of helping the poorer in our society, it would damage their welfare, and that is economic management, as was pointed out in the introduction, was actually not bad. He has a very good record. French people complain about the rise in energy prices, but in France, they only rose by 4%. what, 29% in the rest of the EU and 54% in the UK. So that's why. Okay,
Let me, just before you go too far, I want to get Denis in here because Denis, I imagine, despite the loss, you do not believe this is the end for Marine Le Pen. I mean, if she can't win the presidency, how hard is she going to be working now to increase seats in the legislative election? And where do you think that will take the far right in France?
Yes, she lost. However, I mean, we cannot just sweep away the fact that she gathered like millions of voters. I mean, she has a strong, political base that she can work with. I believe, I'm not sure if she's going to run for another presidential. I mean, she was clear that presidential elections are very tiring, very time consuming. So I'm not sure what's going to happen in 5 years, but she's a big political figure, and I'm pretty sure she will be involved somehow in the next, the legislative election or in June. I'm sure she will still be very, engaged and, from that standpoint. I don't see her like leaving the political field anytime soon. Maybe not, as running as a president, but definitely still be engaged. Yes.
Let me ask you though, Denis. I mean, if the war in Ukraine had not broken out, and her kind of controversial support for Vladimir Putin had been exposed as much as it had in the campaign, do you think she could have fared much better?
I'm not sure. I mean, it's just perspective. I think she was, as a trail of assumptions, we told about her that she was pro-Putin, which has never been the case. From the very beginning, she rejected the invasion of Ukraine. She was very clear. One thing that she said, that she thinks France should be a third voice and should work on a policy of appeasement between the two parties and to avoid, war to continue. And she was very clear on that.
Fair enough.
I also believe. Go ahead.
No, I continue quickly. Yeah, go ahead. Let you finish your statement.
No, and I think what we've seen is between the first one and two round, that all the system gather against her with the same same accusation that she's an extremist, and that if she's elected, the economy will collapse. I mean, all those things that we know happens every 5 years during elections. So I don't really think the war in Ukraine or even the COVID crisis, would have changed anything, in terms of how the system, attacked her during those two rounds.
Okay, let's move on then to Macron going forward. Nabila, one of the biggest criticisms of Macron's last term was how he managed that yellow vest movement. Do you think those protests, they will return? And if so, I mean, will he handle things differently this time? Has he learned some lessons?
Well, I think, first of all, Macron has won his second term because he's the least unpopular candidate in a very mediocre bunch, to be perfectly honest. And there is, this, he spoke in his acceptance speech about unifying France, but I think there is this myth about the president of France being a great unifying figure that everybody loves. This doesn't happen in democracies. On the contrary, incumbent presidents are always very unpopular. And that's why the last two before him, François Hollande and indeed Nicolas Sarkozy, were rejected roundly just after one term in office. Now, there are literally millions of far-right voters and indeed far-left voters who dislike Macron and even despise him. But he will. This will always be the case, if you like, when you're a moderate, a centrist president. I think, protests are very likely to happen again. I think he's guilty himself of turning very much to the far right during his 5 years in office. For example, when there were years of protests from the Yellow Vest, that mass movement which took to the street almost every Saturday for months, he didn't reply by bringing in social policies to deal with their grievances. He brought in more paramilitary officers on the street to fight them. He's also guilty of tapping into the far-right program. For example, he made very controversial claims about Muslim communities allegedly leading separate lives and portraying Muslims as a whole as the enemy within, which is a classic bigoted trope.
Okay.
So he will have.
Nabila, I'm sorry, I've seen Jacques' eyes pop open enough several instances as you were speaking there. I really need to find out why. Go ahead, Jacques.
I think it's a very caricatural view of Macron's attitude to Islam and immigration. It's not okay. He passed a law 2 years ago against Islamist separatism, but let's not forget that this law was actually even balanced. Let's not forget it was in a very difficult context, and you have to take into account the mood of the people if you are a political leader. Let's not forget that it happened after the decapitation of a teacher by an Islamist who has been whipped up by social networks. And he passed these laws, which was considered at the time as fairly balanced. And even the rector of the Mosque of Paris approved of the law. It was an attempt at suppressing outside foreign influences within the Muslim communities in France, in mosque, and sometimes in school support systems. So that's
okay, Denis, I can see you agree, but Nabila, you definitely disagree. Do go ahead quickly, your response.
Yeah, very quickly. First of all, when atrocities happen and they're linked to people who claim to have a link with groups linked to Islam, you do not respond by spreading collective guilt and holding the entire Muslim community responsible
for that. He
did not
say that. He never said that. He never said that.
Distinctly, because I worked on this story as a journalist, Macron penning a column for the Financial Times claiming that toddlers in France were put in burqas by their parents, 3-4-year-old toddlers, and it appeared to be a completely fake news story. So this again leads to stigmatization, perfectly law-abiding communities.
Okay. I want to get
about the headscarf. He did not stigmatize the Muslim, on the opposite. And I think they voted strongly for him.
I'd like to get Denis in this, because as you speak about this
peacefully.
Okay. Denis, I do want to get your take on it, because this is, of course, part of the could-be legislative agenda of the National Rally, if they do take more seats, is to push for the anti-Islamic agenda. Where do you see that going? Not just for the legislative elections, but for the far right in France going forward? How much will that challenge Macron? Do you think you'll see him, as Nabila seems to think he has done in the past, push closer to the far right?
This little debate with our colleagues is very interesting. It means, it reveals that question over Islamization, more so to speak, is actually is very important in France, and it's not just an extreme right subject. Then the entire society is involved in these topics. So do I think that Emmanuel Macron will use that or pivot, his previous policy? Probably yes. But I think what's very urgent in our society right now, and we have seen this, with the Yellow Vest movement, is the social crisis that's coming. That's coming. And that I believe it's the number one issue that the French people as a whole will have to face in a very near future. He didn't take care of the social movement at all, and Nabila is correct. His response was, to send the police to quiet this. Yes, sir. Yeah, it is. And I would say, if I want to be cynical, thank God for him, COVID happened. So he was able to prevent
Putin after that, and some measures were taken, and there was the whole issue of the big debate with the French people getting close, debates all over France, and there was really, I can't remember the amount of money, which was Putin trying to solve the material problems highlighted by the Yellow Vest. And let's not forget also that the Yellow Vest, they were not spring chickens. They really were, they were incredibly violent.
Okay,
remember the Triomphe and so on? That was violent.
Denis, go ahead and finish before I get back to Nabila. Go ahead.
No, I disagree with our colleague here. The Yellow Vest movement, at the end, I agree with you, was sabotaged by violent groups. But the original Yellow Vest movement, yeah, if you recall, there were people gathering in small towns, small cities, and they were, crying for a better life. I think
Right.
if you don't hear those people, I guarantee you in the next few months, we're going to have this movement and probably even more harsher that we have experienced.
Yeah, Nabila, so where does that leave? I mean, Macron has promised to make these difficult economic reforms to make the economy more productive. But if that yellow vest threat is lurking constantly, I mean, where do you see France going? Even if Dennis is forecasting the next couple months for the movement to raise its head again. Where do you see it?
I mean, France is a country of protest, isn't it? It was built on many revolutions, and we are unlikely to see protest going away, especially so when voters, voters, made it very clear that they objected to Macron's effectively business-minded program. He's viewed as the president of the rich who belongs to a global elite. He's an ex-banker, and he, controversially introduced very right-wing policy already when he was economy minister under the administration of François Hollande. So in order to deal with the grievances of the vast majority of people, as we've seen the far right and indeed the far left, they were very much concerned by issues such as inequality, injustices, cost of living. So we'll have to see his liberal, economic liberal policies won't cut it. We will have to see more policies given
Nabila,
wealth.
I'm going to have to give you the final word. Very unfortunately, we're out of time for this edition of The Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists so much for being with us, and our viewers, of course, as well. Remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.